August 14th, 1945 marked the day Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, announcing surrender, but in the remote Philippine island of Mindanao, the war refused to end cleanly. 3 weeks later, Corporal James William Montgomery of the United States Army's 33rd Infantry Division stood guard outside a makeshift detention facility where the chaos of victory had deposited an unexpected burden. 17 Japanese civilians pulled from caves and abandoned bunkers, their faces hollow with months of hiding. Among them moved Fumiko Nakamura, barely 8 years old, her frame diminished by rationed rice and terror. She kept her hands folded across her stomach whenever possible, a gesture the other detainees mistook for cold or fear. James noticed her first on September 7th, when she stumbled during the morning count, catching herself against the bamboo wall with a gasp that seemed to carry more than simple exhaustion. The detention camp sprawled across what had been a coconut plantation near Davao, its perimeter marked by hastily strung wire and guard towers cobbled from salvaged lumber. Military bureaucracy moved slowly in these final days of the Pacific War, and the 17 Japanese civilians existed in a legal gray space between enemy combatants and displaced persons. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Harrison, the camp administrator, spent most days drinking whiskey in his office, leaving the daily operations to sergeants who cared more about rotation home than prisoner welfare. James had turned 23 that summer, old enough to have seen combat at Luzon, but young enough to still believe individuals mattered in the machinery of war. He'd grown up in rural Montana, where his father ran a small ranch and taught him that honor meant protecting those weaker than yourself, regardless of uniform or nationality. That philosophy had earned him both commendations and reprimands during his 18 months in the Pacific. Historical records from the United States Army Center of Military History document that as of September 1945, approximately 42,000 Japanese military personnel and civilians remained in various stages of processing across the Philippine archipelago, creating significant logistical challenges for occupation forces. On September 11th, Fumiko collapsed during afternoon rice distribution. James was the nearest guard, and he reached her before she struck the mud-packed ground. Her eyes rolled back, showing white streaked with broken vessels. Sergeant William O'Brien, a thick-necked career soldier from Boston, barked at James to drag her to the medical tent, as if she were cargo rather than a person. The medical tent consisted of 4 poles, a canvas roof, and Lieutenant David Fisher, a 26-year-old medic from Philadelphia who'd learned battlefield medicine through necessity rather than formal training. He examined Fumiko with practiced efficiency while James waited outside, listening to the rustle of palm fronds and distant conversations in Japanese from the detention barracks. Lieutenant Fisher emerged 7 minutes later, his expression caught between professional detachment and genuine concern. He pulled James aside, away from the other guards smoking cigarettes near the tent entrance. "She's pregnant," Fisher said quietly, wiping sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "Maybe 4 months along, possibly 5. She's severely malnourished, and in this environment without proper medical care. He didn't finish the sentence, but James understood the implications perfectly. The revelation hung between them like the oppressive tropical humidity. Pregnant Japanese prisoners of war occupied a category for which no manual provided guidance. The official policy treated all detainees as potential security risks pending repatriation to Japan, a process that might take months or longer. No provisions existed for pregnant teenagers who'd spent the war's final year hiding in Philippine jungles. "Does Colonel Harrison know?" James asked, already dreading the answer. Fisher shook his head. "Not yet. And Montgomery, you should understand something. There are men in this camp who'd see her condition as an opportunity to make her disappear. One less mouth to feed, one less complication in the paperwork. I've already heard sergeants joking about accidents." James felt his jaw tighten. He'd witnessed enough casual cruelty during the war to know Fisher wasn't exaggerating. The dehumanization that made combat possible didn't simply evaporate with surrender. For some soldiers, Japanese civilians remained acceptable targets of contempt and worse. "What do we do?" James asked, though part of him already knew the answer would complicate his life immeasurably. Fisher studied him carefully, measuring something beyond simple military competence. We keep her alive until she can be processed properly, but it won't be easy. She need extra food, clean water, protection from the other guards. Someone needs to take responsibility. The unspoken question floated between them until James nodded slowly. In that gesture, beneath a September sky heavy with rain clouds, he accepted a burden that would transform the trajectory of his entire life. September 13th brought the first real test of James's commitment when Sergeant O'Brien discovered the extra rice ration James had requisitioned for Fumiko. The confrontation erupted in the supply tent, where O'Brien's face turned the color of raw beef as he waved the requisition form like evidence of treason. "You're feeding these Jap bastards extra while our boys are still on SIR rations?" O'Brien's voice carried across the compound, drawing attention from soldiers and detainees alike. "This girl ain't special, Montgomery. She's enemy, same as the rest." James stood his ground, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Lieutenant Fisher authorized it for medical reasons, Sergeant." "It's documented in her file." "Medical reasons," O'Brien spat into the mud. "She got herself knocked up by some Jap soldier that ain't our problem. You think the Japs gave extra rations to American prisoners? You think they cared when our boys were starving in camps?" The argument contained undeniable truth. James had heard the stories from Bataan survivors, had seen photographs of skeletal Americans liberated from Japanese prison camps. The Imperial Japanese Army's treatment of prisoners had been documented as barbaric, and many American soldiers carried that knowledge like acid in their bellies. But James had also read the newspaper accounts of what American forces had done at Saipan and Okinawa, where Japanese civilians had jumped from cliffs rather than surrendered because they'd been told Americans would rape and murder them. He'd seen enough of war to understand that neither side held monopoly on righteousness. "We're better than that, Sergeant," James said quietly. "Or we're supposed to be—" O'Brien stepped closer, his breath hot and sour. "You got feelings for this Jap girl, Montgomery? That what this is about? Because fraternization with enemy nationals is a court-martial offense, and I will burn you for it." James met his gaze without flinching. "I've got feelings about letting pregnant teenagers die when we have the resources to keep them alive, sir." The confrontation might have escalated further if Lieutenant Fisher hadn't emerged from the medical tent at that precise moment, carrying his worn medical bag and the authority of officer rank. He assessed the situation with quick intelligence, then addressed O'Brien with cool formality. "Sergeant, the increased ration for prisoner Nakamura is medically necessary to prevent maternal and fetal mortality. The decision was mine, not Corporal Montgomery's. If you'd like to challenge my medical judgment, you're welcome to bring it to Colonel Harrison." I'm certain he'd appreciate the interruption. The mention of Harrison, notorious for explosive reactions to petty disputes, deflated O'Brien's aggressive posture. He shot James a look promising future retribution, then stalked away muttering about Jap lovers and bleeding hearts. Fisher waited until O'Brien disappeared into the administrative building before turning to James. "You've made an enemy there. O'Brien has friends among the guards, and they'll be watching you now." "I know," James acknowledged. "But what else could I do?" "Nothing," Fisher admitted. "But knowing you did the right thing won't make the consequences any easier." Over the following week, James discovered the accuracy of Fisher's warning. His guard shifts were reassigned to the least desirable hours, midnight to dawn, when mosquitoes swarmed thick as smoke and the darkness amplified every jungle sound into potential threat. His equipment requests were delayed or denied. Other soldiers stopped including him in card games and conversations, enforcing the social isolation that military culture used to punish perceived disloyalty. James endured it all with Montana stubbornness, refusing to show weakness or regret. He also began learning basic Japanese phrases from a pocket dictionary he'd acquired from a departing translator. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. "Dejabu desu ka?" for "Are you okay?" and "Shinpai shinide" for "Don't worry." But Fumiko's eyes widened with surprise when he attempted them during his guard rounds. On September 21st, she spoke to him for the first time, her voice barely audible above the evening rain pattering against banana leaves. "Why you help me?" Her English emerged halting but comprehensible, learned from somewhere in her past. James crouched outside the detention barracks where she sat near the entrance, taking advantage of the fresher air. "Because it's right," he answered simply. Fumiko shook her head, confusion and suspicion warring across her delicate features. Americans hate Japanese, I see faces. They want me dead. James couldn't deny it. He'd seen those same faces, heard those same sentiments. Some do, he admitted. But we're not all the same, just like you're not all the same as the soldiers who hurt Americans. She studied him with dark eyes that had witnessed more than any 18-year-old should. Baby father is dead, she said after a long silence. Killed at Lady, he was not soldier, he was farmer, forced to fight. Good man. The revelation shifted something in James's understanding. He'd assumed, as had everyone else, that she'd been involved with a Japanese soldier. But she'd been civilian caught in war's grinding machinery, her relationship with another civilian forced into uniform against his will. I'm sorry, James said, and meant it. Fumiko touched her stomach gently, a gesture James had seen her make countless times. Baby is all I have from him. Must protect. Must survive? You will, James promised, though he had no authority to make such guarantees. Both of you will. October 1st arrived with news that shifted the entire camp's atmosphere. Repatriation ships would begin arriving at Davao Harbor within 3 weeks to transport Japanese civilians back to their homeland. The announcement should have brought relief, but James felt only deepening dread. Japan lay in ruins, its cities bombed into ash, its infrastructure shattered. What life awaited a pregnant 18-year-old girl with no family support and a baby fathered by a dead conscript? Lieutenant Fisher shared James's concerns. They discussed it in hushed tones during a rare quiet moment in the medical tent. While Fumiko rested on a cot nearby, her pregnancy now visible despite her loose clothing. Japan's facing starvation, Fisher said, referencing reports that had circulated among the officers. The blockade destroyed their supply chains, and the occupation forces are struggling to prevent mass famine. Pregnant women and babies will be lowest priority for resources. James rubbed his face, exhaustion and frustration combining into a headache that pulsed behind his eyes. There has to be something we can do. Some exception? Some provision for humanitarian cases? The military doesn't think in terms of humanitarian exceptions, Fisher replied grimly. It thinks in terms of policy and logistics. She's Japanese, therefore she gets repatriated to Japan. End of discussion. But James couldn't accept that finality. Over the next week, he began researching alternatives, spending his limited free time in the camp's administrative office, where a sympathetic clerk named Private Tommy Chun helped him navigate military regulations and international law. Chun, whose Chinese-American family had faced their own discrimination during the war, understood the stakes in ways other soldiers didn't. There's something called protected person status under the Geneva Conventions, Chun explained one evening, spreading documents across a battered desk. It's meant for civilians in occupied territory who face persecution or danger if returned home. But getting it approved ... he whistled low. You'd need documentation, medical evidence, and approval from officers way above Harrison's pay grade. Then we get it, James said, with more confidence than he felt. Chun looked at him with something between admiration and pity. Montgomery, you know what you're risking here? This isn't just about extra rations anymore. If you formally petition for protected status for a Japanese national, you're putting your entire military career on the line. Hell, you could face charges of aiding the enemy. James had considered these risks during the sleepless nights on guard duty, weighing them against the alternative of sending Fumiko to almost certain death. His decision had crystallized during one particularly long midnight shift, when he'd watched her sleeping in the detention barracks, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. Some things mattered more than career, more than even personal safety. I know, he told Chun. Let's do it anyway. The petition process proved Byzantine in its complexity. James needed medical documentation from Fisher detailing Fumiko's malnutrition and the pregnancy complications. He needed character statements from guards who'd observed her behavior, confirming she posed no security threat. Most difficult of all, he needed Fumiko's own testimony about the circumstances of her pregnancy and why returning to Japan would endanger her life. That last requirement meant genuine conversation, which meant James needed to improve his rudimentary Japanese or find a translator willing to risk association with his increasingly controversial cause. He found both in an unexpected source, Kenji Yamamoto, a 57-year-old Japanese civilian detainee who'd worked as an English teacher in Manila before the war. Yamamoto agreed to help after James approached him during morning exercises on October 7th, explaining the situation in halting Japanese supplemented with gestures. The older man listened carefully, his weathered face impassive, before responding in near-perfect English. "You understand that helping her puts me at risk too," Yamamoto said. "The other Japanese here, they see cooperation with Americans as betrayal. And when we return to Japan, such cooperation might be remembered badly." "I understand," James acknowledged. "And I won't ask you to do something that endangers you. But this girl needs help, and I can't provide it alone." Yamamoto gazed across the compound toward where Fumiko sat in morning sunlight, mending a torn shirt with careful stitches. Something in his expression softened. "My daughter would be about her age now. If she had survived the bombing of Tokyo, for her memory, I will help." With Yamamoto's translation assistance, James spent the next several evenings gathering Fumiko's story. She spoke haltingly at first, reluctant to trust, but gradually the narrative emerged in painful detail. She'd been living with her uncle's family in Davao before the war, where her uncle managed a small trading business. When fighting intensified, they'd fled into the interior with other Japanese civilians, hoping to avoid both American attacks and Filipino resistance forces. Her uncle and aunt had died during an artillery barrage in January 1945. She'd survived by hiding with a group of refugees that included Hiroaki Tanaka, the farmer-turned-soldier who'd become the father of her child. They'd fallen in love during those desperate months, finding brief tenderness amid overwhelming fear. Hiroaki had been killed during the American landing at Leyte Gulf, shot while trying to surrender, his hands raised but his uniform marking him as enemy. "He told me baby's name should be Masaru if boy," Fumiko said through Yamamoto's translation, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Means victory. He hoped baby would have victory over war, over hate. Would have better life." James documented everything carefully, his handwriting cramped and precise on the official forms Private Chun had provided. The petition grew to 17 pages, supplemented with Fisher's medical reports and character statements from 3 guards who'd been persuaded through various combinations of appeal and pressure to vouch for Fumiko's non-threatening nature. On October 15th, James submitted the completed petition through official channels, knowing it would climb a bureaucratic ladder whose upper rungs remained far beyond his sight. Colonel Harrison signed off with barely a glance, clearly eager to dump any decision onto higher authority. From there, the documents traveled to Divisional Command, then to Occupation Headquarters in Manila, each level adding weeks of delay to an already desperate timeline. The repatriation ships were scheduled to arrive November 5th. October 23rd brought the first response to James's petition, though not the one he'd hoped for. Major Robert Crawford arrived at the detention camp with 2 military police officers and an expression suggesting he'd discovered something distasteful on his boot. Crawford was 41 years old, a career officer from Virginia whose family had produced military men for 4 generations. He summoned James to Colonel Harrison's office with the curtness of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Corporal Montgomery," Crawford began without preamble, dropping James's petition onto Harrison's desk like contaminated material. "Do you understand the absurdity of what you've attempted here? You're requesting protected person status for an enemy national based on pregnancy that occurred during wartime with another enemy combatant. This isn't humanitarian aid. This is fantasy." James stood at attention, keeping his voice level despite the anger rising in his chest. "Sir, the petition is based on legitimate concerns about Fumiko Nakamura's survival if repatriated to Japan in her current medical condition. Lieutenant Fisher's reports document severe malnutrition and pregnancy complications that—" "I've read Fisher's reports," Crawford interrupted. "I've also read reports about conditions in Japanese prison camps where American soldiers were deliberately starved to death, where they were tortured, used for medical experiments, executed for entertainment. You want me to extend special consideration to Japanese nationals while Americans who survived those camps are still recovering in hospitals?" The argument struck familiar notes, echoing Sergeant O'Brien's earlier accusations. James had prepared for this line of reasoning, though finding effective counter-arguments proved difficult when the underlying facts were undeniable. Japanese war crimes had been extensive and horrific. American soldiers had legitimate reasons for hatred. "Sir, with respect, what happened to American prisoners was criminal," James said carefully. "But this girl wasn't responsible for those crimes. She's 18 years old, she was a civilian refugee, and she's carrying a child who didn't choose to be conceived during wartime. Punishing her doesn't undo what happened to our soldiers." Crawford's expression hardened. "This isn't about punishment, Corporal. It's about policy, logistics, and political reality. The American people are not interested in extending charity to Japanese nationals while our boys are still coming home in boxes. Do you understand the political firestorm that would erupt if word got out that we're providing protected status to pregnant Japanese women? Every newspaper from Boston to Los Angeles would run headlines about coddling the enemy." Colonel Harrison, who'd remained silent throughout the exchange while working through his daily whiskey, finally spoke up. "Crawford's right, Montgomery. This petition is dead on arrival. The girl gets on the repatriation ship with everyone else. End of discussion." But James had anticipated this rejection, had prepared a secondary argument during sleepless nights planning for every contingency. "Sir, there's precedent for humanitarian exceptions. The Geneva Conventions specifically address vulnerable populations, including pregnant women, and Supreme Commander MacArthur himself has issued directives about proper treatment of Japanese civilians to demonstrate American values to the world. Denying protection to a pregnant teenager could be seen as violating those directives." Crawford's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you threatening to go over your chain of command, Corporal? Because that would be insubordination, which is a court-martial offense." "No, sir," James replied quickly. "I'm simply noting that the petition follows established legal frameworks and directives from Supreme Command. Rejecting it might require formal justification that could draw attention from higher authorities." The implicit warning hung in the air. Rejecting the petition created documentation that might prove embarrassing if scrutinized by MacArthur's headquarters, or, worse, by journalists looking for stories about occupation policies. Crawford's jaw worked silently, clearly recognizing the political trap James had constructed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Montgomery," Crawford said quietly. "One that could destroy your career and land you in a military prison. Is this Japanese girl really worth that?" James met his gaze steadily. "Doing the right thing is always worth it, sir." Crawford gathered the petition documents with visible distaste. "I'm taking this to Manila for further review. Don't expect miracles, and don't interfere with normal repatriation procedures. If that ship arrives before we reach a decision, Nakamura goes on it. Understood?" "Understood, sir." After Crawford departed, Harrison fixed James with a bleary stare that combined grudging respect with professional concern. "You've got balls, Montgomery, I'll give you that. But you've also made powerful enemies. Crawford's going to remember this, and men like him have long memories. When this war's over and we're all back in peacetime army, you'll find doors closed that should be open." "I know, sir," James acknowledged. "But I can live with closed doors. I couldn't live with knowing I sent a pregnant girl to her death when I could have prevented it." Harrison's expression flickered with something that might have been understanding before the professional mask returned. "Dismissed, Corporal." James exited the administrative building into tropical twilight, where mosquitoes had begun their nightly assault and other soldiers gathered for evening meal. He felt both exhausted and strangely energized, knowing he'd bought time but uncertain how much or whether it would prove sufficient. Fumiko waited near the medical tent, her pregnancy now undeniable at 5 months along. She'd been teaching herself more English with Yamamoto's help, and her vocabulary had expanded significantly over recent weeks. "You fight for me," she said when James approached. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he confirmed. "Why?" A question she'd asked before, but this time carried different weight. She genuinely wanted to understand what motivated this American soldier to risk everything for an enemy he'd never known before September. James struggled to articulate motivations that felt simultaneously simple and impossibly complex. "Because you're a person?" he finally said. "Not Japanese, not enemy, not even just a pregnant girl. You're a person with hopes and dreams, someone who loved and lost, someone who deserves a chance at life." And if we win this war but lose sight of that basic truth, then what have we really won? Fumiko's eyes glistened with tears. She reached out tentatively, touching James's hand with fingertips that trembled slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me as person." That moment of connection, brief, powerful, utterly human, made every risk worthwhile. November 1st arrived with agonizing slowness, marking 4 days until the repatriation ship's scheduled arrival. James had heard nothing from Manila regarding his petition, and the silence felt more oppressive than outright rejection. He threw himself into work, volunteering for extra guard shifts and maintenance duties, anything to keep his mind occupied and prevent the creeping despair that threatened during quiet moments. Lieutenant Fisher had grown increasingly worried about Fumiko's physical condition. The pregnancy had progressed to approximately 23 weeks, but her malnutrition meant the fetus was measuring small for gestational age. Fisher confided to James that without improved nutrition and prenatal care, the chances of successful delivery dropped significantly. "She needs real medical facilities," Fisher said during a stolen conversation in the medical tent. "Not this glorified first aid station. If she goes into premature labor here, I won't be able to save either her or the baby. And if she gets on that repatriation ship to face months in refugee camps in Japan, He didn't finish the sentence, but his expression communicated everything. On November 2nd, salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. Private Chun burst into James's barracks during afternoon downtime, waving a telegram with barely contained excitement. "Montgomery, you need to see this right now." The telegram had originated from Manila, from the office of Colonel Margaret Hamilton, chief of the Women's Army Corps Auxiliary Unit attached to Supreme Command. Hamilton had somehow learned of Fumiko's situation, James suspected. Chun might have quietly ensured the right people received information and had taken a personal interest. Her telegram bypassed Major Crawford entirely, directing Colonel Harrison to delay Fumiko Nakamura's repatriation pending medical review and potential transfer to WA-supervised civilian protection facilities in Manila. "How did you manage this?" James asked Chun, reading the telegram for the third time to convince himself it was real. Chun's grin was unrepentant. "My sister works as a translator for Colonel Hamilton's office. I might have mentioned your petition to her during our last correspondence. Hamilton served as a nurse in the Great War and has strong opinions about pregnant women being sent into dangerous conditions. Once she heard the details, she moved fast." James felt like someone had removed a crushing weight from his chest. The reprieve wasn't permanent protection, but it bought precious time and shifted Fumiko into the oversight of someone who might actually care about her welfare. The victory proved short-lived. That evening, Sergeant O'Brien confronted James near the detention barracks, his face mottled with rage. "You went behind our backs. You got your Jap girlfriend special treatment while the rest of them get shipped back where they belong. You think that makes you noble? It makes you a traitor." "It makes me someone who follows military directives from Supreme Command," James countered, knowing his response would only inflame O'Brien's anger, but unwilling to show submission. "Colonel Hamilton's orders supersede local authority. Fumiko Nakamura is now under WAC protection." O'Brien stepped closer, his bulk intimidating in the gathering darkness. "You know what happens to traitors, Montgomery? They have accidents. Fall off guard towers, drown during river patrol. All sorts of unfortunate incidents in combat zones." The threat was explicit enough to qualify as criminal, but James knew reporting it would only escalate tensions. "If anything happens to me, Sergeant, there are people who'll ask questions. Private Chun has documentation of everything, and Lieutenant Fisher has medical records that tell the whole story. You harm me, and you'll hang for it." O'Brien's fist clenched, and for a moment James thought the confrontation might turn physical. But Lieutenant Fisher chose that moment to emerge from the medical tent, his presence adding a witness that made violence less viable. O'Brien spat at James's feet and stalked away, but his parting words carried ominous promise. "This ain't over." Fisher waited until O'Brien disappeared before speaking. "You need to be careful, James. O'Brien's got friends, and some of them are just as angry as he is." "Watch your back." "I know," James acknowledged. "But what choice do I have?" "None," Fisher admitted. "Once you commit to the right thing, you ride it out to the end. November 3rd brought the logistics of Fumiko's transfer. A military transport truck would arrive November 4th to take her to Manila, where WAC facilities had space in a civilian protection compound. The compound housed other vulnerable Japanese civilians awaiting final determination of their status, mostly women, children, and elderly individuals who'd been caught in the Philippines when war erupted. James spent November 3rd helping Fumiko prepare for the journey. Such as preparation was possible given she owned nothing except the clothes she wore and a small cloth bundle containing mementos of Hiroaki Tanaka. She'd fashioned a tiny baby garment from scraps of fabric begged from the camp's supply tent, her stitches precise despite limited materials. "I scared," she admitted to James as they sat outside the detention barracks in late afternoon sunlight. Yamamoto had given them privacy, understanding they needed time for difficult conversation. "Manila is far." "I not know what happened there. You'll be safer," James assured her, though he wrestled with his own uncertainties. "Colonel Hamilton will make sure you get proper food, medical care, protection, and when the baby comes, you'll have help." Fumiko touched her belly, a gesture that had become habitual. "You will visit?" The question surprised James, though it shouldn't have. Over the past 2 months, they'd developed something that transcended guard-prisoner dynamics. Not quite friendship, given the power imbalance and circumstances, but a connection built on shared humanity recognized in dark times. "If I can," James promised. "My unit might get rotation orders soon, but I'll try to visit before I ship home." "Home is Montana?" Fumiko had absorbed details about his life during their conversations, her English improving steadily through determined study with Yamamoto. "Yes, big sky country. Mountains, rivers, space to breathe. Sounds beautiful," she said wistfully. "Maybe someday I see America. Maybe baby grow up somewhere peaceful." James wanted to promise her that future, wanted to guarantee she and her child would find safety and opportunity. But he'd learned during the war that such promises were hollow. The best he could offer was honest effort and refusal to abandon her to bureaucratic indifference. "Maybe," he agreed, "the world's changing. Things that seem impossible now might be possible in a few years." That night, James slept poorly, his dreams filled with fragmented images of ships departing, trucks carrying people to unknown destinations, and Fumiko's face asking questions he couldn't answer. November 4th dawned clear and hot, the sun rising over Mindanao with indifferent brilliance. The transport truck arrived at 0900 hours, driven by Corporal Sarah Williams of the Women's Army Corps, a no-nonsense 28-year-old from Ohio who handled the military vehicle with casual competence. She'd brought another WAC member, Private Janet Martinez, to assist with the transfer and ensure Fumiko's comfort during the journey. James helped Fumiko climb into the truck's covered bed, where Williams had arranged cushions and blankets to ease the bumpy ride. The other Japanese detainees watched the departure with mixed expressions, some relieved that Fumiko's visible pregnancy would no longer complicate their own situations. Others resentful that she'd received special consideration denied to them. Yamamoto approached James before the truck departed, speaking quietly in English. "You've done a good thing, Montgomery-san. In a war filled with hate, you showed compassion. That matters more than you may realize. I just hope it's enough," James replied. "Hope is never just anything," Yamamoto said with gentle wisdom. "Hope is everything." The truck departed at 0930, leaving James standing in the compound entrance watching until it disappeared around a curve in the muddy road. He felt simultaneously relieved and bereft, as if he'd invested so much emotional energy in protecting Fumiko that her departure left a vacuum he didn't know how to fill. The remainder of November 4th passed in numbing routine. James pulled his regular guard shift, ate meals that tasted like cardboard, and tried to ignore the hostile stares from O'Brien and his allies. The detention camp seemed smaller somehow, less significant now that the crisis that had defined his past 2 months had moved beyond his immediate control. That evening, Lieutenant Fisher found him sitting alone near the perimeter fence, watching twilight paint the jungle in shades of purple and gold. Fisher dropped onto the ground beside him, producing a flask of whiskey that he'd somehow acquired despite regulations. "Drink?" Fisher offered. James accepted gratefully, the burn of alcohol providing momentary distraction from the churning thoughts that wouldn't settle. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before Fisher spoke. "I got orders today. We're rotating home in 3 weeks. 33rd Division is being deactivated as part of post-war drawdown. Most of us will be discharged by January. The news should have brought joy home, civilian life, freedom from military structure and tropical misery. Instead, James felt only complicated ambivalence. Home meant leaving behind unfinished business, meant losing track of what happened to Fumiko and her baby, meant returning to a world that had continued without him while he'd changed in ways that might no longer fit. "What are you going to do?" James asked. "After discharge?" Fisher shrugged. "Go back to Philadelphia, probably. Finish medical school, if they'll still have me. Try to forget the things I've seen." He paused, then added quietly, "What about you?" "I don't know," James admitted. "Montana seems like another planet right now. My father wants me to take over the ranch, but I'm not sure I can go back to worrying about cattle prices and hay yields after everything that's happened." "We're all going to have trouble adjusting," Fisher observed. "This war changed everyone who fought in it. The world back home kept moving forward while we were stuck in this hell, and when we return we'll be strangers in familiar places." The observation carried uncomfortable truth. James had received letters from his family throughout his deployment, but the gap between their daily concerns and his wartime experiences felt unbridgeable. How could he explain what he'd witnessed, what he'd done, what he'd learned about humanity's capacity for both cruelty and compassion? On November 7th, James received a letter from Manila. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat and feminine, and for a confused moment he thought it might be from Fumiko before remembering she'd had no way to contact him. The signature revealed the actual sender, Colonel Margaret Hamilton. "Corporal Montgomery, I wanted to personally thank you for bringing Miss Nakamura's situation to official attention through your petition. It takes courage to advocate for vulnerable individuals when doing so invites criticism and professional risk. Miss Nakamura arrived safely at our civilian protection facility and is receiving appropriate prenatal care from our medical staff. Her condition is stable, though she remains significantly underweight. We are working to address her nutritional deficiencies and prepare for delivery, which we anticipate will occur in mid-February 1946. I have also reviewed your petition for protected person status. While I cannot make final determination on such matters, I am recommending approval to the appropriate authorities based on humanitarian grounds and Miss Nakamura's particular vulnerabilities. Such approval will allow her to remain in American protection during the critical months surrounding childbirth and potentially provide pathway to resettlement rather than repatriation to Japan. Your actions reflect well on the United States Army and on American values more broadly. We win wars with weapons, but we win peace through compassion and justice. Never doubt that what you've done matters. Respectfully, Colonel Margaret Hamilton, Chief, WSC Auxiliary Services." James read the letter 3 times, emotion tightening his throat. Hamilton's words provided validation he hadn't realized he desperately needed. For 2 months he'd second-guessed his decisions, wondering whether he was being naive or foolish, whether protecting one pregnant girl justified the professional consequences and hostility he'd endured. Now, with discharge approaching and the immediate crisis past, he could acknowledge the deeper truth. He'd needed to protect Fumiko as much as she'd needed protection. The war had confronted him with impossible moral choices, had forced him to kill men who might have been farmers or shopkeepers if born in different circumstances. Saving Fumiko represented redemption of sorts, proof that he could still act with decency despite the corrosion of combat. He wrote back to Colonel Hamilton that evening, thanking her for the update and requesting permission to visit the civilian protection facility when possible. He also wrote to Fumiko, though he had no idea she could read English well enough to understand. He kept the message simple, telling her he was glad she'd arrived safely and wishing her health and happiness. The letters went out with the next mail truck, carrying his words across miles and through bureaucratic systems to uncertain destinations. November 20th brought the long-anticipated rotation orders. The 33rd Infantry Division would begin phased withdrawal from the Philippines starting December 1st, with most personnel returning to San Francisco for processing and discharge. James's name appeared on the first transport list, scheduled to depart Davao on December 3rd. The news triggered mixed reactions throughout the detention camp. Most soldiers celebrated loudly, counting days until they could leave the tropical humidity and return to families they'd been separated from for years. James joined the celebrations mechanically, aware he should feel grateful but unable to shake the melancholy that had settled over him since Fumiko's departure. He spent the intervening days completing final duties and preparing for transition. The Japanese detention compound was being transferred to Filipino civilian authority, with the remaining detainees scheduled for repatriation on ships that would arrive in mid-December. The war's bureaucratic aftermath ground forward with slow inevitability, processing millions of displaced persons through systems barely adequate for the task. On November 28th, James received unexpected permission to visit Manila before departure. Colonel Harrison, perhaps feeling generous with James's service ending, approved a 3-day leave. Lieutenant Fisher, whose own departure was scheduled a week later, helped James secure transportation aboard a supply truck heading north. The journey to Manila took 8 hours over roads damaged by war and monsoon rains. James dozed fitfully in the truck bed, surrounded by crates of supplies and 3 other soldiers also traveling for various administrative reasons. The landscape transformed gradually from jungle to agricultural areas to the outskirts of Manila itself, where destruction from the February 1945 battle remained starkly visible. According to historical accounts documented by the United States Army Military History Institute, the Battle of Manila in February 1945 resulted in approximately 100,000 Filipino civilian deaths and the destruction of much of the city's infrastructure, making it one of the Pacific War's most devastating urban battles. The Civilian Protection Facility occupied a former school building in the Ermita district, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes but structurally intact. Razor wire surrounded the perimeter, and military police guarded the entrance, but the atmosphere felt distinctly different from the detention camp, less prison-like, more protective. Corporal Williams, whom James remembered from the transport, met him at the gate and escorted him inside. "Miss Nakamura's doing well," Williams reported as they walked through corridors filled with Japanese women and children. "Her English has improved dramatically, and she's been helping our translators with some of the other civilians." Smart girl. They found Fumiko in a common room, teaching basic English to a group of younger children using hand-drawn flashcards. Her pregnancy was now prominently visible at nearly 27 weeks, her borrowed dress straining across her expanded belly. When she saw James, her face transformed with joy so genuine it made his chest ache. "Montgomery-san?" She abandoned the lesson and crossed the room with more speed than seemed wise given her condition. For a moment James thought she might embrace him, but she stopped short, Japanese formality reasserting itself. Instead, she bowed deeply, then extended her hand in a gesture that blended cultural traditions. James took her hand gently. "You look healthy." "They're treating you well?" "Very well," Fumiko confirmed, leading him to chairs near the window where they could speak privately. "Food is good, medicine is good. Doctors say baby is strong now, growing." Her English had indeed improved remarkably. Williams had been right about Fumiko's intelligence. Given education and opportunity, she would have thrived in circumstances not ravaged by war. James felt renewed anger at the waste of potential that conflict represented. All the lives disrupted and destroyed for political decisions made by men far from battlefields. They talked for 2 hours, conversation flowing more easily than ever before. Fumiko described her daily life at the facility, the friendships she'd formed with other Japanese women, the classes in English and basic childcare that WSC personnel provided. She spoke about her hopes for the future with tentative optimism, acknowledging uncertainty but choosing to focus on possibilities rather than fears. "Colonel Hamilton say maybe I can stay in Philippines after baby born," Fumiko explained. "Filipino government needs teachers for English. If I pass test, maybe I can work, make life here. Not perfect, but better than Japan now." James felt relief at hearing this plan. The Philippines offered better prospects than devastated Japan, and Fumiko's teaching skills would serve her well. "That sounds like a good opportunity." "You'd be excellent teacher." "You think so?" Her need for validation was touching, reminder that beneath the resilience she'd developed, she remained 18 years old and frightened about her future. "I know so," James assured her. "You're smart, determined, and you care about people. That's what makes great teachers." Fumiko's eyes glistened with tears. "You give me hope when I had none. Save my life, save baby's life. How I can thank you." "You don't need to thank me," James said quietly. "Just live well. Build a good life for yourself and your child. That's all the thanks I need." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching children play in the courtyard beyond the window. The moment felt suspended outside normal time, a bubble of peace amid the turbulence that had defined their relationship since September. Finally, Fumiko spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "If baby is boy, I name him James, Japanese version, Jumuzu. So he remember the American soldier who protect us." The gesture hit James harder than expected. He struggled with emotion, aware that this young woman was offering him honor he wasn't certain he deserved. "I'd be privileged," he managed. "But remember, you're the one who survived, who kept fighting for your baby." "I just helped remove some obstacles." "You remove big obstacles," Fumiko insisted. "Without you, I die in camp or die on ship to Japan. You see me as person when others see only enemy." "That is everything." James stayed until evening, reluctant to leave but aware his presence might cause complications if he remained too long. Before departing, he gave Fumiko his family's address in Montana, written carefully on paper Williams provided. "After I'm discharged, I'll be here. If you need help, if there are problems, write to me. I can't promise I'll solve everything, but I'll try." Fumiko folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her dress pocket. "I write. Tell you about baby when born. Maybe someday you meet little Jimizu. I'd like that," James said, and meant it deeply. The farewell was difficult but not tragic. They both understood this separation was necessary, that James's military service was ending and Fumiko's new life was beginning. The connection they'd formed would endure in memory and perhaps occasional correspondence. But the intensity of their shared experience was concluding. As James walked out of the civilian protection facility into Manila's humid night, he felt both grief and gratitude, grief for the war that had brought them together in such terrible circumstances, gratitude that they'd found humanity and compassion despite that darkness. December 3rd arrived with tropical dawn, and James joined 200 other soldiers boarding the USS General M.C. Meigs for the journey home. The transport ship had ferried thousands of servicemen across the Pacific throughout the war, and its worn decks and crowded quarters spoke to years of hard use. James secured a bunk in a compartment with 40 other men, stowed his minimal belongings, and claimed a spot on deck to watch the Philippine Islands recede into the distance. The voyage to San Francisco would take approximately 3 weeks, following a route that stopped briefly at Pearl Harbor for refueling and supplies. James spent the days reading books from the ship's small library, playing cards with soldiers whose names he'd forget within weeks, and writing long letters he wasn't certain he'd ever mail. One letter was addressed to Fumiko, though he had no way to send it until reaching California. He wrote about his mixed feelings regarding homecoming, his uncertainty about civilian life, his gratitude for having known her during impossible circumstances. The writing felt therapeutic even if she never read the words. Another letter was addressed to his parents, attempting to prepare them for the son who'd returned changed from the boy who'd left Montana in March 1944. He wrote about the war sparingly, knowing they couldn't truly understand, but tried to convey that he'd learned things about the world and himself that would take years to fully process. "I met a Japanese girl in the Philippines," he wrote. "She was pregnant and scared, and I helped protect her from people who would have let her die. I know that might sound strange, helping someone from a country we fought, but Dad, you always taught me that honor means protecting those who can't protect themselves. I hope you're proud that I remembered that lesson, even when it was difficult." The transport ship arrived at Pearl Harbor on December 15th. James went ashore for the brief stop, walking through areas he'd last seen in late 1944 when shipping out for combat deployment. The harbor bustled with activity despite the war's end, ships being decommissioned and sailors preparing for discharge. At the Naval Base Post Office, James mailed his letters, including the one addressed to Fumiko, at the Manila Civilian Protection Facility. He had no idea she'd receive it, but the gesture felt important regardless. The final leg of the journey passed slowly. As the ship approached San Francisco on December 23rd, excitement grew among the troops. Men crowded the railings, straining for first glimpses of American coastline. Someone started singing, "God Bless America," and others joined until hundreds of voices carried the melody across the water. James participated quietly, feeling patriotic pride mixed with more complicated emotions. He loved America, believed in its ideals and values. But the war had shown him that those ideals were imperfectly applied, that the gap between what America claimed to be and what it sometimes was required constant effort to close. Protecting Fumiko had been part of that effort, a small attempt to make reality match rhetoric. San Francisco appeared through morning fog on December 23rd, the Golden Gate Bridge emerging like something from a dream. The harbor teemed with ships, and crowds gathered on the docks to welcome returning servicemen. James spotted American flags, banners reading "Welcome Home Heroes," and families scanning faces desperately for loved ones. The disembarkation process took hours. James waited patiently through bureaucratic procedures, medical checks, and administrative processing. By late afternoon, he held his discharge papers and back pay, officially Mr. James William Montgomery again, civilian. He called his parents from a payphone at the processing center, hearing his mother's voice crack with emotion when she realized it was him. They'd drive from Montana to collect him, a journey that would take 2 days. James assured them he was fine, that he'd wait at a serviceman's hotel in San Francisco, that yes, he was truly safe and coming home. Christmas 1945 passed quietly. James attended church service at a chapel near the hotel, surrounded by other recently discharged soldiers and their families. The sermon focused on peace and reconciliation, themes that resonated deeply after years of war. The chaplain spoke about forgiveness, about building futures rather than dwelling in past hatreds. James thought about Fumiko during that service, wondering how she was spending Christmas, whether the Civilian Protection Facility observed the holiday, whether she was thinking about him. The connection between them transcended romance or friendship, existing in some category he couldn't adequately name. They'd been allies in a battle for basic human decency, comrades in refusing to let war completely destroy compassion. His parents arrived late on December 26th, and the reunion was everything James had hoped for and feared. His mother wept openly, holding him with fierce strength. His father shook his hand gravely, eyes suspiciously bright, then pulled him into a crushing embrace that communicated everything words couldn't. They drove home over 2 long days, stopping at motor courts that catered to traveling families. His parents asked careful questions about his service, and James provided sanitized answers, describing the Philippines' landscape and climate while avoiding combat details. They sensed his reluctance and didn't press, understanding that some experiences couldn't be immediately shared. Montana appeared on December 28th, its vast skies and snow-covered mountains exactly as James remembered, yet somehow unfamiliar. The ranch looked smaller than in his memories, the house more weathered. But his childhood bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to the boy he'd been before the war transformed him into someone else. January 1946 unfolded slowly as James adjusted to civilian life's rhythms. He helped his father with ranch work, relearning skills he'd once performed unconsciously. The physical labor felt therapeutic, his body remembering patterns his mind had nearly forgotten. But nights remained difficult, filled with dreams that mixed Philippine jungles with Montana prairies, Fumiko's face appearing in landscapes where she'd never been. On February 14th, a letter arrived from Manila, addressed in handwriting James recognized as Fumiko's, though much improved from her earlier attempts. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, aware his parents were watching with curious expressions. "Dear Montgomery-san, I write with happy news. Baby was born February 9th, healthy boy weighing 2.7 kilograms. Labor was difficult, but doctor and nurses very good. I name him James Masaru Nakamura, combining your name and name his father wanted. He has strong lungs and much hair. Colonel Hamilton has helped me get teaching position at school in Manila for Filipino children learning English. I start in April when I am recovered from birth. Pay is small but enough for room and food. I can make life here. I think of you often, Montgomery-san. Wonder if you are happy in Montana, if your family is proud of you. You should be proud of yourself. You show me that enemies can be friends, that war does not have to destroy all humanity. I teach this to James Masaru when he is old enough to understand. Thank you for everything. You saved 2 lives, mine and my son's. We will remember you always. With gratitude and respect, Fumiko Nakamura James read the letter twice, emotions surging through him that he couldn't entirely name. Relief, joy, satisfaction, and something deeper recognition that his actions had created tangible, positive outcome in a world too often defined by destruction. His mother, unable to contain curiosity, asked gently, "Who's Fumiko?" James looked up from the letter, meeting his parents' expectant gazes. He'd avoided discussing her during their initial conversations, uncertain how they'd react. But hiding felt dishonest, and they deserved to know the truth about his service. "She's a Japanese girl I helped in the Philippines," James explained. "She was 18, pregnant, going to be sent back to Japan where she probably would have died. I filed paperwork to get her protected status and transfer to a safe facility." His father's expression remained carefully neutral. "Why'd you help an enemy?" "Because she wasn't my enemy," James replied firmly. "She was a scared girl carrying a baby. The baby's father was a Japanese farmer forced to fight, killed at Lady. She didn't start the war, didn't commit any crimes. She was just trying to survive." His mother's eyes filled with tears, though whether from pride or concern James couldn't determine. "You risked your career for her?" "I risked getting yelled at by officers," James corrected, "which happened, but it was worth it. She just wrote to tell me she had a healthy baby boy. Named him partly after me." His father was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally he spoke, his voice gruff with emotion. "Your grandfather fought the Germans in France in 1918. Came home hating them with everything he had. Couldn't even hear German spoken without getting angry. Died still carrying that hate." James waited, unsure where this story was leading. "I always thought that was sad," his father continued. "Letting hate eat at you for decades because of a war that ended long ago. You did something different. You saw a person instead of an enemy. That takes more courage than fighting." The approval in his father's voice meant more than James expected. He'd feared his actions might be seen as betrayal or weakness, but his parents understood the deeper principle involved. Over subsequent months, James settled into civilian life while maintaining correspondence with Fumiko. Her letters arrived every 6 to 8 weeks, describing her teaching work, James Masaru's development, and her gradually improving circumstances. She'd found a small apartment in Manila, made friends among Filipino colleagues, and begun building the stable life she'd nearly been denied. James's letters reciprocated with news from Montana, descriptions of ranch life and his slowly healing adjustment to peace. He wrote about his decision to attend the state university on the GI Bill, planning to study education with the goal of becoming a teacher himself. Fumiko's example had inspired him. If she could build meaningful life from war's wreckage, so could he. On December 7, 1946, the one-year anniversary of their meeting, James received a package from Manila. It contained a photograph of Fumiko holding 10-month-old James Masaru, both smiling at the camera. The baby had thick, dark hair and alert eyes that seemed to examine the world with serious curiosity. On the photograph's back, Fumiko had written, "We are living because you cared. Thank you, always." James placed the photograph on his dresser, where it remained for the rest of his life. Whenever anyone asked about it, he'd tell the story not as something heroic, but as simple human decency practiced during inhumane circumstances. He'd explain that wars were fought by ordinary people who faced extraordinary moral choices, and that how those people responded defined what came after conflict ended. James graduated from university in 1950, became a high school history teacher, and eventually married a Montana girl named Sarah, who understood his occasional nightmares and need to correspond with someone from his past. He and Fumiko exchanged letters for decades, their connection evolving into deep friendship that transcended the crisis that first brought them together. James Masaru Nakamura grew up in Manila, became an engineer, and eventually immigrated to the United States in 1972. He visited James in Montana that year, a confident 36-year-old man who'd built successful life from his mother's courage and determination. They spent 3 days talking about everything and nothing, two people connected by history they'd never directly shared. "My mother told me about you my whole life," James Masaru said during that visit. "She said you saw her as human when others saw only enemy. That lesson shaped how she raised me to see people, not categories. To choose compassion over hate." James William Montgomery, 61 years old by then, felt the weight of those decades. The war had receded into history, its hatreds mostly faded, its lessons imperfectly learned by new generations facing new conflicts. But sitting with the man whose life he'd helped preserve, he understood that individual actions mattered, that mercy and justice practiced in small moments could ripple through decades. "Your mother saved herself," James told James Masaru. "I just moved some obstacles. Her strength, her determination, her refusal to give up despite everything, that's what made the difference." "Perhaps," James Masaru acknowledged, "but without you, she would never have had the chance to use that strength. You gave her the opportunity to survive. That matters more than you may realize." They stayed in contact for the rest of James's life. When he died in 1998 at 76 years old, Fumiko, then 71 herself, sent a letter to his widow expressing gratitude that transcended simple words. She described how one American soldier's compassion in 1945 had created ripples extending across decades and oceans, how his choice to see humanity rather than enemy had quite literally created the family she'd built in the years after war ended. The story of James William Montgomery and Fumiko Nakamura never appeared in history books or military records. Their connection was too small, too personal, too specific to warrant formal documentation. But in the broader narrative of World War II's aftermath, their story represented something essential: the recognition that war's ending required not just military victory but moral commitment to building peace through individual acts of courage and compassion. 75 years later, descendants of both families maintained contact. The friendship established in a Philippine detention camp in 1945, continuing through generations who'd never known war's direct impact. They carried forward the lesson James and Fumiko had learned together, that humanity's capacity for compassion could survive even conflict's worst darkness, and that choosing to see people rather than enemies made all the difference in what kind of world emerged after the fighting ended. The war had taken millions of lives, destroyed cities, and scarred continents. But it had also created moments where individuals faced fundamental moral choices about how to treat those designated as enemies. James William Montgomery had faced such a choice in September 1945, and his decision to protect one frightened pregnant girl had created consequences extending far beyond that specific moment. In the end, history consisted not just of battles and political decisions, but also of countless small human interactions where people chose compassion over cruelty, mercy over vengeance, hope over despair. Those choices, replicated across millions of individual circumstances, determined what kind of peace followed war's ending, whether the world moved toward reconciliation or remained trapped in cycles of hatred and retribution. James and Fumiko's story suggested that even in war's darkest moments, humanity endured, and that individual courage to act compassionately could quite literally save lives and create futures that otherwise would never have existed. That lesson remained relevant long after the specific circumstances of 1945 had passed into history, a reminder that every generation faced similar choices about how to treat those designated as different, dangerous, or enemy. The answer James William Montgomery had given in that Philippine detention camp, that every person deserved basic human dignity, regardless of nationality or circumstance, continued echoing through the decades that followed, carried forward by the lives he'd helped preserve and the example he'd provided of what moral courage looked like in practice.